It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Labour MP Dawn Butler, the Financial Times' Laura Hughes and former number 10 polling guru James Johnson. And we will soon be joined by the Conservative MP Nikki Aiken. Today, the government unveils its drugs misuse strategy for England.
300,000 problem drugs users. You've got to deal with what's going on there. You've got to make sure that they're given rehab. You've got to come down tough on the county lines gangs.
I want the Prime Minister to take responsibility for the money that's been taken out of criminal justice in the last 10 years that's caused many of these problems.
I hope that my constituents never elect a racist or a misogynist, but they have a right to do so.
Should they be able to call other MPs liars? And the Foreign Secretary is on manoeuvres saying we shouldn't apologise for our colonial past. As I say, hopefully we will be joined shortly by Conservative MP Nikki Aiken. Let's start today's programme with the government's big drive on drug misuse. Let's show you this headline in The Guardian. Middle-class drug users could lose UK passports under Boris Johnson's plans. This is the government's drive to tackle lifestyle drug taking and also a suggestion if you're found guilty of taking cocaine at a dinner party, there will be serious consequences. Dawn, is this a good idea?
Well, I think it's always a good idea to have a public health approach to how we tackle drug use in our country, because nothing's worked. And over the last decade, there's been so much money taken out of services, taken out of drug rehabilitation centres. And so we've seen more drug deaths in the last 10 years at any other time. So there needs to be a public health approach. You can't sort of police your way out of this. That's not going to work. It's proven that it's not worked.
And as part of that, would you be in favour of passports being taken away from people?
I think that's just trying to catch a headline rather than dealing with the problem. I mean, Dame Carol Black's report has said that there needs to be investment. You know, there needs to be more listening to the people on the ground that are dealing with people who've got a health issue. You know, we have to look at housing. We have to look at education. All of these things go hand in hand if we want to tackle the drug crisis in our country.
Right, well, Dawn, you mentioned those figures. This might be a good point to show everyone this graph, which is deaths related to drug poisoning in England and Wales. And since 2011, you can see the numbers of those who have died from drug poisoning has gone up from just over 2,500 to 4,500. Those are obviously during Conservative governments. Laura, what about this idea of tackling, as the government calls them, middle-class drug users?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a difference here, isn't there, between sort of lifestyle drug users, middle-class people taking a bit of cocaine after their dinner parties in Notting Hill, and drug addicts. There is a massive difference here, and I think the government will need different approaches to take on these very different problems that are facing society. And I think the point the government are really going for is that these sort of lifestyle drug users, I think, don't always believe that they're criminals. But clearly it's the trade and the way that these drugs get onto these dinner party tables is illegal, and people are being harmed in the process. And the interesting point as well the Prime Minister made was that he thought maybe politicians in the past had been fearful of touching this area of public policy because of their own history of taking drugs in the past. You'll remember, of course, the stories that came out about Michael Gove during the leadership campaign, and he used cocaine 20 years ago. I think a lot of politicians potentially have used it. But this is a really interesting angle, because sometimes when we talk about drug problems, you think of sort of heroin addicts, and we're not always talking about recreational users.
James, what's your view, picking up on some of those points, but particularly this idea of lifestyle drug taking?
Well, I can definitely see why the government is doing this from a political point of view. People really do associate reasons for crime with drugs. 6 out of 10 people in a YouGov poll say that their local area has a drugs problem. So it's very much pressing, very much front of mind for a lot of voters. I think on the middle class drugs thing, I do agree with Laura. I think there is a sense of responsibility that a lot of these people who are not doing it for health reasons but are doing it recreationally don't quite realise in terms of supply. So I expect that voters and actually some of those people may well listen a little bit more now with these government measures.
I would say, though, sometimes and often the difference is money. Like if you've got money to be a functioning alcoholic or a functioning drug addict, it's very different. So it's not often how much you're taking, it's just the case of whether you've got money or not. And that's why it's important that we do tackle the middle-class drug users. I mean, there's a really good 10-minute film called Fair Trade on YouTube. I'd recommend that people watch that, and that sort of outlines the whole cycle of drug taking and middle-class use.
I mean, you say politically you can see, James, why the government is doing this, but the figures aren't exactly great, are they, for successive Conservative governments when you see the rise in the number of people that have died from drug poisoning over the last 10 or so years?
No, not at all. And I expect that this is going to be a problem for the Conservatives if they're not seen as getting a grip on it. But the way that voters tend to judge parties on crime is their intention to do things. And actually, even despite that last 10 years, in our last poll in the Red Wall, in the seats that the Conservatives gained from Labour at the last election, actually the Conservatives have a 10-point advantage on crime. So you can see that they see political opportunity in this, but there are some risks for them. I mean, this hypocrisy point referred to about drug taking in Parliament, that could undermine support. And I agree with Dawn, if the measures are seen as being a bit too much for a headline, then that could also erode support for these measures too.
Although interesting, Laura, that the Conservatives and the Prime Minister particularly wanted to spearhead this sort of drive, anti-crime initiative, even if they are still considered to be ahead of Labour on this issue. Labour want to take them on this, don't they?
Yes, very much. I think the Conservatives have always looked to the public to be the party of law and order in recent years, especially. And Priti Patel is popular at a grassroots level because she's very much seen as sort of embodying those traits of the party. But also, if you were being cynical here, you might suggest, and I know this has been in the running for a long time, but there are questions about the government's own behaviour in Number 10, these parties that the media have been reporting on that supposedly happened last Christmas in Number 10. Labour have called for a criminal investigation, the Met to look into those. And so some cynics are arguing from the sidelines today that this whole rhetoric on law and order is trying to distract from that and get the public really back focused on the party, the Conservatives, being tough on crime.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, the video of Dominic Raab on Andrew Marr yesterday saying that the police don't investigate things, going backward, has millions of views on social media. There is nothing that annoys the public more than a sense that it's one rule for them and one rule for everyone else. We've seen that undermining support on COVID, and we could see it on crime as well. When people in Number 10 sort of grid stories, when they say this is what we're going to be doing and on announcing this time, that is tended to be seen internally as these things happening in isolation. We're going to move the story on with a nice thing on crime. Of course, in reality, what voters have just seen, or some voters at least, have seen this whole Christmas party story, and they're going to be interpreting today's announcements in light of that.
Right, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. You remember the expression, Dawn Butler, from the Blair years. Is that what you want to see Yvette Cooper do as the new Shadow Home Secretary? Be tougher, outflank the Conservatives on this issue? No,
I want policies that work. Ultimately, are the policies that we're putting forward, are they going to work? Are they going to ensure that less people die from drug use? Are we going to ensure that people are homed properly? Are we going to ensure that education takes place? All of our policies need to revolve around a public health approach. There's been reports after reports after reports that says this. Dame Carol Black's report is just the latest report. But I think what she's done is referred to the causes of why things have gotten so bad, and that's basically all the money that's been taken out of the system, and that's why it's really got to this stage, and that's why it has to change.
All right, let's move on, and I just want to show you this headline in The Observer from yesterday. Johnson faces trust crisis as Slee shatters faith in MPs. This is a poll revealing huge public cynicism, with just 5% of respondents believing politicians work for the public good. That was a write-up of a new report from the Institute for Public Policy Research, which found looking at polling data over the last few years, the proportion of people who think politicians are out merely for themselves has spiked in recent weeks following allegations of sleaze that we were just talking about. James, what do you make of this finding? Do the public discriminate between parties, or is it a plague on all their houses?
So it's certainly bad. It's clearly getting worse. We saw it accelerate at the start of the pandemic with Dominic Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle. We've seen it obviously be magnified with sleaze. I think one caveat to the main headline of that report is that it was asking about politicians in general. And politicians in general are a very easy target for voters in terms of criticism. When you actually ask about people's local MP, the trust levels are quite a lot higher. So I think that is a bit of saving grace. On the discrimination point, I'm not really sure they do. People in government obviously will be in the headlines more at a particular time, but all of the focus groups that I've done since the sleaze crisis took off has seen people very much saying this is all politicians, not just the Conservatives.
Right. Dawn, what do you make of that? Because obviously the Labour Party and Keir Starmer have tried to make as much as possible, as you would expect for an opposition party, of those allegations of sleaze. And yet, if what James says is true, then it doesn't do you any good either on the opposition side.
Yeah, there is a bit of a plague on all of your houses, and I understand, James does polling, so he would see that from people that he's talking to. But ultimately, that should not worry us or scare us in calling out the hypocrisy of the government at Number 10, talking about, the fact that, Boris Johnson, our Prime Minister, comes to Parliament and lies all the time, and so does these ministers. It shouldn't scare us in doing that, because ultimately it's good for our politics, it's good for our democracy that we have politicians that come to the House of Commons and tell the truth, that we have politicians who are not lawbreakers as well as being lawmakers.
Right.
And at the moment, that's what we've got.
Right.
Too much of that.
Right. Well, Dawn, it's not the first time you have labelled the Prime Minister a liar. In fact, in July, you were ordered to leave the Commons chamber after doing exactly that. Let's just have a look at what happened.
The Prime Minister has not come to the House to correct the record and to correct the fact that he has lied to this House and the country over and over again.
Order. I'm sure that the member will reflect on her words just then, perhaps correct the record.
I mean, Laura, there are rules about what MPs can call each other in the chamber. And obviously, Dawn Butler was asked to leave, which she did do. She left the chamber. And it's seen as excessive and unreasonable. But do you think the public are on Dawn's side, generally, when it comes to calling MPs those sorts of things, or not?
I think the public probably are on Dawn's side. And it got a lot of coverage and it got a lot of pickup on social media, because I think people saw it as an example of an MP standing up to the government, holding them to account. I understand the rules about language, and I understand why the House of Commons needs to be a respectful place where members of Parliament treat each other well, because otherwise you end up in a shouting match. And I don't think the public actually would want to see that. But because it was a sort of singular, exceptional case, I think there was a lot of sympathy. But if we saw that every day and we saw all members of Parliament calling each other names and slagging each other off, I think people would just switch off, to be honest. And so I think there probably is a reason to have those rules in place. But of course, there are circumstances where MPs find themselves incredibly frustrated by the behaviour of the minister or politician in front of them, and they naturally want to call it out. But, it's an interesting one. I think there are also other forums in which MPs can speak about their colleagues. And also, it's worth reflecting, death of David Amess, I think that was a moment where a lot of people thought, right, we do need to tone down our language, because actually, when everyone is attacking each other, the media included in this, it creates a really hostile environment for MPs, and it's not good for public discourse, and it's not good for democracy when actually everyone thinks politicians are awful human beings, because, of course, we know that most of them are not.
Right, well, let's talk about that issue of public discourse, and just to remind our viewers and guests here that our Conservative MP Nikki Aiken is on her way. I mean, isn't it important, James, in the public's mind that public discourse in the House of Commons, in Parliament, is kept to a certain level of civility, and that's why language is important?
Well, I think so, and also rules are there for a reason. I mean, it's obviously, as Laura says, there are exceptional cases, but you can't make exceptions for exceptional cases. I think that I would totally agree with what Laura said about the public's reaction. And when I do focus groups, I occasionally play clips from Parliament, you know, how people respond to certain politicians. And there is one uniform reaction, which is when you hear people hearing or, you know, sort of barracking each other. I watch people physically cringe as they watch those clips because they hate that kind of thing and they hate the sort of gotcha side of things. So I think the more sort of serious disagreements, it might sort of make for less viral social media clips, but I think people do appreciate that more.
Right, well, they hate that sort of thing, Dawn.
I think it's becoming really difficult to function in Parliament because when a minister comes to the dispatch box, the minister decides to rewrite history. And so what we have to do is...
Well, not every minister decides to
Not
rewrite
every
history,
minister,
do they?
but every week there's a minister that comes to the dispatch box.
But that's
almost.
the way it's always been, hasn't it, Dawn?
No, I don't
not in terms of ministers rewriting history, but in terms of ministers, government ministers coming to the dispatch box and issuing either legislation or arguing and defending it. What's different now?
Because they're not telling the truth. And so I think that's a real problem for our democracy. And the ministerial code is really important, used to be really important. Prime ministers used to abide by the ministerial code. If a politician had done wrong, then the Prime Minister would sack that minister. There's not been a minister that the Prime Minister has sacked. And if you think about all of the scandals that's happened since Boris Johnson has been in charge, it's almost unbelievable that nobody has been sacked. So it's a real issue. And so what I'm trying to do, and I'm using all of the tools at my disposal. I've tabled an early day motion 383 calling on the ministerial code to have an independent oversight and scrutiny. So I'm using everything at my disposal to try and get our democracy functioning the way it should. The rules were made decades ago when it was a real old boys club where women were not allowed in Parliament, where they used to smoke cigars, make the law and pat each other on the back and be good old chaps. You know, it's just not that way anymore. So that's why the rules need to change.
James?
Yeah, I can certainly see that argument, and actually, you know, there is another side, of course, where if the public feel that they suddenly see somebody being kicked out of the House of Commons for saying something, they might find that a little bit odd, a little bit antiquated. My point, I think, is about the discourse in general, is that what gets people engaged, interested, actually, are not the sort of the quick clips, the throwing the insults around. It is actually the substance, and that's ultimately what switches people off. And you've seen successive speakers of the House of Commons desperately trying to, you know, make that culture a little bit more open, because they know when they go back to their constituencies, it's the great thing about our system, you know, the Speaker does go back to their constituency, they see the same complaints.
Right, but it's a Labour MP, the Labour chair of the committee, the Standards Committee, that is now drawing up proposals to toughen up the code of conduct for MPs. What do you say to him? Is he making a mistake?
No, I think it's right.
But that includes the language as well that is used by MPs and how they treat each other.
But the point is, if the Prime Minister comes to the House of Commons and tells the truth, there'll be no reason for anyone to say that and to point out that Prime Minister's lying. So everything will go hand in hand. So I'm happy for the rules to be tightened up. I'm happy for it to be a law that members of Parliament, especially ministers, need to come to the House and tell the truth. That's exactly what I want to happen.
Right, but actually you tweeted at the time that you were sent out of the chamber for saying that about the Prime Minister, that some fellow Labour MPs stopped following you on Twitter. In other words, some of your own colleagues didn't approve of what you did. It wasn't just members of the public.
That's true.
Right, what do you say to them?
Well, I was disappointed.
Why?
Because at the end of the day, I'm doing what I can do in my capacity as a backbench member of Parliament to hold our government to account and to make sure that our democracy works. I'm doing my best, and it would have been great to have the support, but it's not going to stop me from doing what is right. What I said was absolutely 100% correct. It wasn't incorrect.
Well, you don't know about it being correct or not. It's certainly
But
what
it was
you
because
feel.
the facts
but
are there,
hang on, Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, actually addressed Labour MPs at this year's party conference, saying it's easy to comfort yourself that your opponents are bad people. Is that all you're doing, just comforting yourself?
No. What I'm doing, I mean, if you watch Peter Stevanovich's video that has over 40 million views, he actually sort of lays it all out. And actually there's another BBC presenter that's now just laying out the facts where the Prime Minister says one thing, but actually the facts are something different. That in anybody's world is a lie.
Nikki Aitken, welcome to the programme and rushing in onto set. What do you say to what you've heard so far from Dawn Butler about the sort of language that can be used against the Prime Minister and that she has used already?
Well, I think we've seen it with the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party too, and it's about the discourse that we as politicians use that then filters into the public. And, you know, it wasn't a fortnight ago that I was at the funeral of my colleague Sir David Amess, and we've all of us from all parties, but also in the media and across all society have got to watch what we say and how we say it, because people do look at politicians and the way we debate. And I mean, I do think we should be looking at the way we treat each other in the Commons as well, because it does filter out into society. But no senior politician or any politician, whether it's a councillor, an MP, a minister, a shadow minister, should be using language that could be used against other people.
Is it important to tell the truth?
It's always important to tell the truth, Dawn, but there's a way of saying it.
What way?
There's a huge difference between debate and discourse and abuse.
Tell me the way to say it that's going to ensure that the Prime Minister and the ministers come to Parliament and tell the truth.
I think they do. Of course they do.
But they don't. It's been proven that they don't.
But if you keep on using that type of language that you've done already, it filters down into the public, and that's where we get that's when we get people thinking that they can't trust politicians. Full stop.
Okay,
and you and I came into politics to make a difference, to improve the communities that we represent, and they expect us to do it properly and to do it.
It's important to tell the truth, and the ministerial code says if a minister has not told the truth, they're supposed to come back to the House at the earliest opportunity and correct the record. 2 weeks ago, a health minister came to the chamber, and to be fair to her, I think she was just given a dud script, right? And so she read from the script. There were inaccuracies in that script. I've written to her and asked her to come back to the House and correct the record. She hasn't done.
Why can't you do that without calling someone a liar?
I didn't call her a liar.
No,
I wrote to her, and she has not come back to the House to correct the record. And at the end of the day, she's called into question the National Audit Office, where the minister's saying the National Audit Office have approved all of the procurement contracts that the government issued, and the National Audit Office hasn't done that. So I'm using all of the levers that I can to try and get these ministers to tell the truth. What I need is members of Parliament to encourage your ministers and to encourage the Prime Minister to tell the truth.
Nikki, do you think Boris Johnson has sort of got a reputation for riding roughshod over the way to behave himself, perhaps, in the House of Commons, which has prompted the sorts of reaction we've heard from Dawn Butler?
No, I think we've got to keep at the back of our minds the fact that this government is dealing with a once-in-a-100-year pandemic, and they are doing all it can to ensure that we are safe and that we've got the booster programme. So, I do not believe that the Prime Minister or any minister does anything that that brings the House into dispute. I just don't believe it. They are working day in, day out to keep this country safe.
All right. The problem. They all cover each other's backs without dealing with the issue, and that is the problem. That's what's wrong with our democracy.
All right, well, let's have a look at another aspect of what the Standards Committee has done in terms of drawing up proposals for this new code of conduct. It is about not using unparliamentary or excessive language and abuse. It's also that MPs should demonstrate anti-discriminatory attitudes through the promotion of anti-racism, inclusion and diversity. Now, this prompted one Conservative MP to express the following concern. You heard a bit of it in the headlines. Let's listen to him again about this code.
The principle of democracy is undermined by the requirement that we may be required to subscribe to behaviours to promote certain attitudes. I hope that my constituents never elect a racist or a misogynist, but they have a right to do so.
Dawn, is he right? Do they have a right to do so?
I think it's not very ambitious, is it, to appeal to the fact that, constituents should elect or can elect a racist or a misogynistic member of Parliament. I think we should aim for better than that. And so I was
saying the same, but it's about constituents' right to do so.
No, I mean, the whole point of the rules, as I understand it, is saying that these are the certain standards that we expect from our members of Parliament. So therefore, if you have those standards that is cross-party, that in effect you can't elect a racist or a misogynist, to think that, well, actually you should have the right to do so, I think is severely missing the point and actually quite dangerous to the discourse of Parliament.
Well, is that dangerous to the discourse of Parliament, what Desmond Swayne said?
Well, it's not government policy. I think he's trying to make a point, as Dawn says, and I agree with what Dawn said there. It's about democracy and what is at the heart of our democracy, and that is the public's right to vote for who they wish to represent them in Parliament. I hope that we will never elect a misogynist or a racist or anybody who doesn't believe in inclusion and diversity. But our democracy allows for people to stand for Parliament on whatever ticket, and people have the choice then to vote for them or not.
All right, well, let's go to some of the politics of this beyond the words themselves, because politics is the art of persuading people to vote for you. Laura, it was interesting that Keir Starmer chose to raise this issue in his conference speech. It was more in response to the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, using the word scum, something that she apologised for subsequently. But in terms of trying to persuade people to come over, do you think that Keir Starmer was actually trying to rein in the sorts of things we've heard Dawn Butler say?
Yeah, I think he was, because I think the Angela Rayner comments, which she has apologised for, crossed a line for many people, and I think it's slightly separate actually to what Dawn Butler said, because that sort of language, I think, went a bit further, and the Labour Party knows that it's really not within their interests to be going out on the airwaves and using phrases like that and using words like that, because it just puts people off, because it looks petty and it looks aggressive. And I think this point's already been made on the programme, but often the best way to get your point across is through intelligent questions and through, you know, reasonable debate and intelligent, sensible points that can be made in a way that makes people listen and not just switch off. Because, of course, the danger is if you're just shouting all the time, people don't listen anymore, whether that's your opposition MP or members of the public. And even if that person is making a very valid point, it's just off-putting. People switch off from that, and that's not good too for democracy, because actually the best way sometimes to hold someone to account is through a more measured approach. I mean, just from a journalistic perspective, my job is in essence also to try and hold both parties, but especially the government, to account. And I wouldn't write an article in which I had a headline or an intro that just said, Boris Johnson today lied, or Boris Johnson today was scum. You would make points and you would show through your reporting and through both sides of the argument what had actually happened that day, and leave it for readers and the public to come to their own conclusions. And I think Keir Starmer's approach more generally is to be a little bit more balanced. And you can see in his appearances in PMQs, he's using his sort of barrister background to make those arguments in quite a level way. And actually, when it comes to somebody like Boris Johnson, that can be more effective, because that caps him out when you quietly and slowly and calmly keep going back on the same point, and then it shows your opposition can't actually answer.
Right, is that the right strategy by Keir Starmer, or should he be taking the fight a little bit more firmly to the Tories?
Well, Keir will do things his way, and that's why it's good that we have politicians who attack, who approach a situation differently. But I think the problem with the Prime Minister is, he just bats things back, doesn't he, in a jokey manner, and he doesn't really take responsibility. I mean, he never has done, has he, for anything he's done throughout his career. So,
Nikki?
I think it's a complete nonsense. He's got a huge successful track record as Mayor for London. He now has, as the Prime Minister, having, got us through as far as he can with the pandemic to date. And, the first thing he did last week when the Omicron variant appeared was, acted swiftly. So, I think Dawn is not correct there.
There's a middle ground here, though, right, with this language. Putting the Parliamentary Convention to one side, I don't think anybody is seriously suggesting that Dawn Butler calling somebody a liar is going to lead to, violence in the streets. Whereas there are other words that politicians have used, and Angela Rayner is a better example of that, where, that language is unsuitable. So it's not just about tying everybody with the same brush, and we need to be careful of that. The other thing that we need to remember is of course, that we don't want to go down the route of the US, and I totally agree about that, polarisation route. But I think this needs a more nuanced approach. Anybody criticising the government being accused of using dangerous language, I think, is a slightly unsafe road to go down too.
All right, let's look at the front page of the Times.
Can I just say, the Prime Minister used the word traitor and all kinds of language, which was really quite inflammatory.
Right, well, let's have a look at this on the front page of the Times, which is the Prime Minister plans to let ministers throw out legal rulings. This is about allowing ministers to overrule judicial reviews. Now, the government spokesperson, or the Ministry of Justice spokesman, has said they don't recognise the story and there are no current plans. But is it a good idea, Nikki?
Well, again, I don't know anything about this, and we can't really go on briefings by special advisors, whoever it is that
but
makes
the fun. Just basically, right. So, but is it a good idea?
I think we need an independent judiciary. We've got a very proud tradition of an independent judiciary, but I think we've got to make sure that the issue we had with Brexit, and I think Brexit was a clear example of where the largest vote in British history, whether we liked it or not, and I voted Remain, and I was devastated when we lost that referendum, but I accepted it, big difference. But for 3 years, the whole of Parliament came to a standstill because Parliament would not agree and accept that referendum result and went to judicial review, and again, the judges didn't. So there's got to be a place where there's got to be a balance. There's always going to be a balance. And Parliament, where we are sent as representatives of the people, have got to have the supreme decision-making, in my view.
Dawn?
So I agree with Nikki in terms of the independent judiciary. So the Prime Minister should leave them alone. Because so many times the Prime Minister tried to override the independent judiciary, tried to threaten judges, having them on the front pages of newspapers. You know, we've got the most authoritarian government that we've ever had in our country, and we need to ensure that our independent judiciary stays that way.
Well, I don't recognise how. I mean, you know, I'm
policing powers. I mean, we could be here for ages.
Policing powers. What policing powers? Tell me about them.
What, stopping people from protesting?
They're not trying to... Do not start on that one.
Arresting people if they go equipped to protest? What does that mean?
Being the MP for Westminster, I can tell you that the biggest issue in my mailbag is complaints from people, local people, and people living in social housing round the corner from here, who have got to deal with week in, week out protests, with helicopters going around. It's not about stopping the protests, it's about managing them and making sure that people cannot stop the traffic on Westminster Bridge, stopping ambulances getting to St Thomas's. It's about protests in a democracy. I have no issue with that, and that bill does not do that. What the bill will do is stop people bringing central London to a standstill. That's what it does.
You do know you're missing the major point of protest,
No, I'm not missing
right?
the protest.
The major point of protest is that it's not
Dawn.
supposed to be comfortable and convenient. That
exactly.
That is the major point of protest.
But it's not about putting lives at risk either,
nothing
Dawn,
gets changed. Suffragettes, women would not have got the vote.
It's not about putting other people's lives at risk.
No,
St Thomas's.
We don't want to put people's lives at risk, but you know, we wouldn't have got the vote if, you know, women just like politely said, please give us the vote, please.
There's a very big difference between what the suffragettes do and what the likes of XR and Insulate Britain do today.
But having a protest that's too loud, what does that mean?
I didn't talk about too loud.
No, but it is a part of the bill. There is a line in the bill about
I talked, well, and I think it's interesting that it was the Labour government that introduced banning protests within a kilometre of Parliament and stopped people being able to use loud hailers.
I don't understand the point. You just pivoted to something else.
Because what I'm saying to you is you're saying it's about an authoritarian government. It was a Labour government that stopped that.
I'm saying what's in the bill. Stick to what's in the bill.
All right,
in the bill, it's about peaceful protests, and it's about the right to protest, but not bringing central London
Government
or any
should not determine how people protest.
We're going to park this discussion here just for a moment. I just want to bring in Laura and James on the issue of the headline itself. Is this just a PR exercise, Laura, with the government saying it doesn't really recognise the story that they do want to have ministers overruling judicial review?
Well, I think this has huge political context here, which we should just mention. And obviously, this comes off the back of a number of things. Supreme Court ruling that Boris Johnson was wrong to prorogue Parliament when he did a few years ago, that Theresa May was wrong to invoke Article 50 without a vote in the House of Commons. We've seen lots of judicial reviews over the issue of PPE contracts being taken on by the government during the pandemic. They're a headache for the government, and it's really interesting to hear the different sides of this argument, because on the one hand you have Conservatives arguing that it's the will of the people is supreme here above all else, but others' perspectives, and perhaps voters' perspectives, might be that actually the principle of judicial review is that the government is not above the law. Now, it looks very black and white on the surface, and to many it is, but obviously it's very complex here, because issues like Brexit were so politically charged that any decision made by anyone was seen inherently as being political. So it's whether or not you're really defending the principle of the law being above all else, or of politicians being above all else, because they are there to represent the public. But of course, the public, once they have elected people into government, might not have the power to actually ensure that they are above the law. And that's why we have this process in place at the moment, but clearly there are a lot of people who would want to see this happening, which is why I'm sure it was briefed to the Times this morning.
James, what do the public think?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that strong democracies have strong courts, and we are ultimately in a country where Parliament is sovereign. So if Parliament really doesn't like a law, they can change it. So that remains the truth. I think the problem is with this particular proposal, and as Nick says, you know, it's not government policy; it's just a briefing, so massive caution needed. Is that it seems to sort of carve out exemptions on an annual basis, and I think that is a problem. And I think the thing I'd say to people, anyone sort of proposing that or defending it, particularly from the Conservative point of view, is imagine Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell having that power. Now, you know, a lot of press wouldn't like it, a lot of Conservative MPs wouldn't like it, I wouldn't like it. I think that's really the key thing. You know, this is something that isn't just convenient for one Parliament, it's going to be something that lasts for quite a long time.
Dawn?
I think we should look at all policies in that way. That's why...
But would you feel the same about Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell having that?
I would trust them more than I trust Boris Johnson. But the whole point is, this is why, you know, my early day motion in regards to ministerial code will apply to anybody that's in government, whether it's a Labour government, a Tory government, you know, a coalition government. And that's why, you know, and that's why we have to have those safeguards, because at the moment we have got somebody in number 10 who's not trustworthy.
All right, let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Mail. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss will urge Britain to stop the guilt about colonial past as she tries to burnish her credentials as the present-day Margaret Thatcher. This is referring to a speech that Liz Truss will make later this week in which she will say, rather than being racked with shame about our history and doubt about our future, it's time for Britain to be proud once again of who we are and what we stand for. Do you agree with that, Nikki?
I think we should never forget our history. I think we have to remember where we've come from, and you know,
are we really racked with shame and not proud of who we are?
Well, I think the Labour Party certainly keep pushing that, and the conversations I've had with Labour MPs and what we've heard in the House of Commons. But I think we need to be proud of this country. There's nothing wrong with being proud of this country, but we have to remember the past. But what happened in this country 200, 300, 400 years ago was of its time. It's about, I think we have to understand our history to accept our present and be able to go forward for the future. And, you know, women, as Dawn said earlier, women didn't have the vote 100 years ago, just over 100 years ago. So we've come so far, but it's about our future, but not forgetting our past and not always... it's a very difficult one because I know Dawn is feels very strongly about this, but I do really believe we've got to move on. We really do now.
Is it time to move on, or are you racked with shame about our history?
Move on from what, exactly?
Move on to accept that, you know, what happened in the past is the past and not forget it. But, you know, what happened 300 years ago, you and I now, as politicians, well, 300 years ago, you and I wouldn't have been in Parliament. We've got to work together to ensure it's the future of our children now and our young people now, for making sure that they've got the education, that they've got the ability, wherever you're born in this country, whatever your background, that you can achieve to the best of your ability. And that we, you know, at the moment, I think we haven't got enough women in politics. We haven't got enough women in areas of senior roles across society, and the same for people of colour.
Right, well, let's go back to this speech and what Liz Truss has actually said. Those words, racked with shame about our history, is she talking about you?
How is she talking about me?
I mean, are you racked with shame about our history?
No, this is almost like a non-argument, and I think this is like a dead cat kind of strategy where Liz Truss is trying to appeal to a certain demographic because she's the most photographed Tory MP, and I think she's more in line to take over from Boris. So I think it's all a bit of that. At the end of the day...
You did say in October 2020, at the moment, history is taught to make one group of people feel inferior and another group of people feel superior, and this has to stop. We need to look at history and we need to improve it. That was in a House of Commons debate during Black History Month
100%.
in 2020.
We have to decolonise our history books. We have to ensure that how history is taught in schools represent everything that's happened. You can't just forget forget what's happened sort of 300 years ago. You don't say that about any other time. And we're talking about slavery, right? You don't say that about the Holocaust. You don't say, well, forget that happened all those years ago. You don't say that. So let's not insult people by having that line. But ultimately, there's nothing wrong being realistic about history. Teach it in its entirety. That's all. That shouldn't offend anybody if you teach history in its entirety. If you understand the contributions that have been made from all sectors, there's nothing wrong with ensuring that structures and systems that discriminate are undone. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it will make society better. It would mean that everybody will be able to achieve what they want to achieve in life because they wouldn't be held back by structural inequalities, that are from bylaws, from, back in the time when, huge disparities and discrimination exist. There's just nothing wrong with teaching history in its entirety. And I think, as I say, it's sort of a dead cat strategy from this.
Well, on the dead cat strategy and the politics of it, let's show the picture to our viewers, Laura, of Liz Truss in the tank, channeling her inner Margaret Thatcher. We showed it last week. What's she up to, Liz Truss?
I think it would be hard to not conclude what Liz Truss is up to, and she's clearly pivoting towards leadership. She wants to be our next Prime Minister, and it's very much, I think, the strategy of the people around her to get her out there as much as possible looking like Margaret Thatcher, because they know that plays incredibly well with the Conservative grassroots and the base of the party. And polling really does validate what they're doing, because it shows she's the most popular cabinet minister out there at the moment. And it really, it's this speech and everything, it's all about her playing to a particular audience. Of course, she's speaking in some ways as the Foreign Secretary, and this is, I think, a speech about diplomats around the world advocating for Britain. But she knows exactly what she's doing.
Yes.
It's making these sorts of comments.
Right. I mean, she may be appealing to grassroots Conservatives, James, and obviously keeps topping the poll amongst grassroots and the party faithful. But what about the public? Do they like her?
Well, she's quite unknown, quite frankly. I mean, the most popular cabinet minister...
Well, she Instagrams all the time. That's probably...
Indeed, probably trying to turn that around. But the most popular cabinet minister with the British public as a whole is Rishi Sunak. The second most popular is Sajid Javid. And Liz Truss is sort of around near the bottom to the middle of the pack. So, and actually, even amongst the Conservative members, interestingly, yes, on that cabinet approval satisfaction table that Laura referred to there, Liz Truss is top. But when you ask Conservative members who would they most like as the next leader, actually Rishi Sunak is still quite far ahead. So I think Liz Truss has quite a lot of work to do on electability until Tory members start changing their minds.
Is Liz Truss your woman?
I wasn't aware that there was a leadership going on at the moment. There's no contest. I mean, the media seem to be really whipping this up.
Ignoring the fact that there's no contest.
Look, this is the first female Foreign Secretary the Conservative government has had. If that was a male Foreign Secretary in that tank, nothing would have been said. And the fact that they were comparing her to Margaret Thatcher because that was the last woman we had in the tank.
But that is why Liz Truss is doing it.
To be fair, Jo, she was out making a really important point about NATO and the threat that the Estonia and Latvia and Lithuanian places...
It was just a coincidence that she looked exactly, I think, almost had the headscarf around the same way. But
I think Mrs Thatcher didn't have a helmet on. Health and safety in the 80s was very different.
Maybe I haven't focused on that picture enough. Just before we go, I want to bring you your attention to this story. BBC News here. COVID. UK Red List criticised as travel apartheid by Nigeria. This is the High Commissioner of Nigeria that's saying placing his country on the UK's Red List in terms of travel restrictions is a form of apartheid. Is he right, Dawn?
Well, I think ultimately we have to say, what do we have to do to keep people as safe as possible? And the number one thing that should have been done as soon as this Omicron variant became public, remember, it existed in Europe before it existed in Africa, but, they didn't report it, is to get people tested before they get on the plane, before they come into the country.
Which is what Labour has argued for, and now the government's adopted it. But this is the reaction from...
But it was days.
But this is the reaction now, today, from the Nigerian High Commissioner. Is he right? Is it a form of apartheid?
Well, ultimately, you have to look at the facts and the science. And the facts is, why is that decision being taken to Nigeria and not being taken to other countries in Europe?
Well, it is other countries in Africa.
Why is that? At the end of the day, the Omicron variant was in Europe before it was in Africa. So let's look at the facts and let's look at the science and let's make sure that it all makes sense. At the moment, I'm not quite sure that the government's having this all make sense. And we also need to look at the costs, making sure that people are not overcharged to take a PCR test. And we also need to make sure...
So do you agree with the Labour
people...
policy to have pre-departure tests or not?
Yeah, no, I do.
Right, even with the costs that they incur.
But I think more needs to be done. So it doesn't have to be... At the moment, it's the prices vary from 20 quid to 150 quid plus, which is a lot of money on people who are travelling, especially in families.
Right,
and the government can do something about that, and the government hasn't.
Nikki, it's pretty damning in response to the government policy to say this is travel apartheid. What do you say in response?
I think we have to be all realistic that this virus is not going away anytime soon, and that we've all got to be there to be as safe as possible, and we are going to have to expect this type of policy once we see a variant come into place.
All right, well, thank you. Well, thank you very much to all of our guests. I will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with more Politics Live from all of us here. Bye-bye.